On this Monday night, calls to search for all lost Indigenous children. The discovery of unmarked graves at a former Kamloops residential school lead to demands for a plan to find all the buried children.
The deaths of these children have brought it all home, and I think it's just the tip of the iceberg.
Their deaths undocumented but not unknown. The trauma generations of Indigenous families carry, and the calls to act as if they were your children. Managing Manitoba's overflowing ICUs.
We have absolutely overtaxed our ICU staff.
More COVID-19 patients flown out of the province as new admissions keep coming. Political uncertainty. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's rivals unite to unseat him. And it's hockey night for health workers. Fans in the stands as the Leafs and Habs face off.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Across the country, symbols of mourning and grief. From Parliament Hill to provincial legislatures, flags were lowered to half-mast, vigils held, and shoes lined up to represent the up to 215 children whose remains have been found in unmarked graves on the grounds of a former residential school in Kamloops, reopening old wounds for Indigenous families torn apart.
It is a great open secret that our children lie on these properties of former schools. An open secret that Canadians can no longer look away from.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission identified 3,200 deaths of children in residential schools, but the real number is higher. So many records are lacking. Names and genders weren't recorded. Parents weren't informed. The chair of the commission, Murray Sinclair, has said the number of children who died could be as high as 6,000. There were about 140 residential schools across Canada. Indigenous children were forcibly taken from their homes, prohibited from speaking their language or learning their culture. There are now calls to find all the lost children, not just the more than 200 who have been discovered thanks to ground-penetrating radar in unmarked graves in Kamloops. There is a collective sense they and their families deserve more than just lowered flags and empty political promises. Heather Yourex-West has our top story tonight.
Alan Knockwood was a young child when he was taken from his family and forced to live in a residential school.
We were punished for any hint of disobedience. I was 9 years old and they took my hands out like this, and I had 10 hits on each hand with the strap. And it caused my hands to swell up to the point where I couldn't move them.
Still, Knockwood says he considers himself lucky. He survived. At least 215 children in Kamloops did not. And across the country, Indigenous community members believe there are many more victims that remain unaccounted for.
There was a lot of first-degree murders that happened in those schools. So it triggered a lot of emotions for thousands of people right across this country.
In Saskatchewan, the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations say it's time to conduct radar ground searches at residential school sites across the province. Near Calgary, the Siksika Nation is asking an investigation be carried out at every site across the country.
I had to take a drive and have a good cry. Out of that remembering, but also being grateful to these children that were found. And the probability of finding children here too, around this school.
The past few days have been traumatizing for survivors like Butch Wolfleg, remembering not only those who died at the schools, but in the years since they came home.
Their way of dealing with this trauma is through addictions, dulling the pain. And a lot of them died while they were dulling the pain.
Speaking about such a painful past is not easy. For many survivors, it's not something they often do. But there is also a deep need to ensure these stories are told, so that moving forward there can be peace and justice that is just not possible without accountability and truth. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.
Today, BC Premier John Horgan addressed the discovery at the former residential school in Kamloops. He says he was horrified when he heard the news and says making amends is the least his government can do.
We're a proud people. We've done extraordinary things together, but we've also done atrocious things together. And collectively, we have a responsibility to face that head on. And after the discovery of a mass grave in Kamloops, it's more real now than ever before.
There is renewed pressure on the federal government to help find all the lost graves of Indigenous children who died at residential schools. And this is far from the first call to action. As David Akin reports, the Trudeau government is now being urged to do more to fulfill key recommendations made by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
As a dad, I can't imagine what it would feel like to have my kids taken away from me. And as Prime Minister, I am appalled by the shameful policy that stole Indigenous children from their communities.
Campaigning to be Prime Minister in 2015, Justin Trudeau promised he would implement all 94 recommendations made by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, including 6 that had to do with missing children and burial information. Things like creating a national register of student deaths, a register of burial places, and funding burial ceremonies and commemorations.
Those calls to action have not been fully implemented. So that's the frustration. Like, you have a report. We don't want it gathering dust.
The commission did a lot of work to figure out how many children died and where they are buried, but some work was left undone when the Harper government turned down a request by the commission for an extra $1.5 million to help locate missing cemeteries. It would not be until 2019 when the Trudeau government set aside funds, about $34 million, to implement the 6 commission recommendations on burial sites of children.
They need to fully fund the work that needs to be done to identify the unmarked graves of children across Canada, because there are many, many more.
But as of this week, the status of all the commission recommendations involving Ottawa is unfinished, incomplete. Talks continue.
So far, there's a lot of distance between their statements and their actions towards children. And we need to be watching carefully their actions.
We've got to grieve this moment, but for the federal government, it's not good enough to just continue with symbolic gestures.
Trudeau responded to that Monday.
We promised concrete action, and that's how we'll support survivors, families, and Indigenous peoples.
Now, Trudeau would not say what he means by concrete action. That could take a couple of days to work out. But in the meantime, MPs agreed unanimously to hold an urgent debate on this issue tomorrow. Donna?
David, a lot of people say it's time for less talk, more action. Advocates like Cindy Blackstock say one concrete action could be to end these court battles involving residential school survivors and Indigenous children. What's the likelihood of that?
Well, I asked Trudeau about that today, and it doesn't sound to me like the government of Canada is going to back off 3 court cases it has ongoing. One of those involves residential school survivors at St. Anne's School in Northern Ontario. And this school, by the way, is a school where they used an electric chair to punish the kids. And St. Anne's survivors have had to go to court to get Canada to turn over documents about how the kids there were cared for. The other 2 cases involved care of the current generation of Indigenous kids. Ottawa's appealing a couple of human rights rulings. One of those cases is in court in a couple of weeks. But you're right, advocates and some parliamentarians say Ottawa should just drop all 3 of these legal cases and get on with the task of caring for survivors and the current generation of Indigenous kids. Donna?
All right, David Akin, thanks. The NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh, says the federal government needs to make some tough decisions about its commitment to remedy the injustice of the residential school system. And this was his answer when he was asked what message he has for the families who lost children.
I'm sorry. We're going to fight for justice for you.
So many people are at a loss for words. The school in Kamloops was run by the Catholic Church, and there are renewed calls for the church to apologize for its role in the residential school system. The Pope has stopped short of doing that. Today, the president of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops released a statement saying, "I express our deepest sorrow for the heartrending loss of the children at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. As we see ever more clearly the pain and suffering of the past, the Bishops of Canada pledge to continue walking side by side with Indigenous peoples in the present, seeking greater healing and reconciliation for the future." Across the country, personal stories are being shared about the impact of residential schools. We want to share a powerful speech delivered by Indigenous MP Romeo Saganash. It was back in 2014, but it still resonates today. He made the speech while calling for a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. And he recalled his own brother's death in a residential school.
Let me tell you a little story, Mr. Speaker, about a little boy named Jagmeet, who was sent to residential school in 1954. He was 5 years old, never came back, apparently died the first year he arrived in residential school. His mom, Mr. Speaker, his mom never knew till after 2 years of his death. His mom, my mom, for 40 years never knew where Jagmeet was buried. For 40 years, Mr. Speaker. And it is only by coincidence one day that one of my sisters happened to be in the area, and someone told her, "I know where your little brother is buried." So after 40 years, my sister filmed the site where he was buried, brought the film back to my mom to show her. I saw my mother cry many times. But the day she saw that video, I had never seen her cry that way. That's closure, Mr. Speaker. That's what we call closure.
There is some support for survivors. A 24-hour crisis line is available for anyone experiencing pain or distress as a result of their residential school experience. They can call toll-free and speak in confidence. The number is 1-866-925-4419. Impossible to keep up. Coming up, Manitoba's intensive care units grapple with a record caseload of COVID-19 patients. Manitoba has announced a major change to its vaccine rollout. The province is now allowing vaccine mixing, so eligible Manitobans who got a first dose of AstraZeneca can get an mRNA vaccine as their second dose. The head of Manitoba's rollout says the decision was based on results from a Spanish study. It hoped to have data from a major UK study as well, but that was delayed, and Dr. Joss Reimer says the province could not afford to wait.
So it would have been ideal to also have the UK study results before making this decision. But that's the nature of a pandemic. The science is changing all the time, and we have to make decisions in the best way that we can with the information that's available to us.
There is growing urgency to get second doses to Manitobans. The healthcare system is struggling to deal with a brutal third wave of infections. As Brittany Greenslade reports, hospitals are still overwhelmed.
You were kind of kept in this area that was completely plasticed off. You were curtained off. You couldn't go and see anybody. Only the nurses came in or the doctor came in.
It was Maria Nichols' worst nightmare. Just days away from her vaccine appointment, she ended up in hospital isolation with COVID-19 as her concerns for herself and her husband, who also had the virus, grew.
Am I going to end up taking him to emerge because he needs a ventilator? Like, we both had the same concerns and the same fears that, it's going to get worse. And I consider myself very fortunate that it didn't.
But so many others were not so lucky. Manitoba's ICUs are seeing unprecedented surges of patients. Over the weekend, the province hit another unfortunate record milestone. 30 COVID patients were admitted to ICU within a 48-hour period.
It's disappointing, discouraging to have these numbers so high. It's exhausting and it's stressful. So we worry about sustaining them long term.
And it's becoming impossible to keep up. So far, 40 Manitobans have been transferred out of province for care in Ontario and Saskatchewan ICUs.
The intensive care unit staff is completely exhausted and especially mentally exhausted to move a number of patients per day, which is unheard of for us in our intensive care, to ship out of province, more than one person a day. So the whole endeavor is really very taxing and quite extraordinary.
Doctors have been calling for a complete lockdown to not just stop cases, but help healthcare workers who are on the brink of breaking down.
We have absolutely overtaxed our ICU staff. I shudder to think of what happens if some of them start to give up, because they're really, it's been a long haul.
One that right now has no end in sight. Brittany Greenslade, Global News, Winnipeg.
The World Health Organization has unveiled a new naming system for all those COVID-19 variants. The agency says it's now using letters from the Greek alphabet. So Alpha is the new name for B117, first identified in the UK. The B1351 variant, first detected in South Africa, is now Beta. P1 is Gamma, and the variant first detected in India is now called Delta. The WHO says it wanted to make all those names easier to remember and wanted to reduce the stigma of using country-based labels. In Vietnam, authorities are tightening restrictions after detecting what they call a very dangerous hybrid variant. The country's health minister says the new highly transmissible variant appears to be a combination of the Alpha and Delta variants first detected in the UK and India. It may be partly responsible for the country's spike in cases. Vietnam had kept numbers low throughout the pandemic, but international flights into the capital are now suspended, and a mass testing campaign is underway in Ho Chi Minh City. Ahead, why Israel's political rivals are banding together to unseat the Prime Minister. The longest-serving Prime Minister of Israel is on increasingly shaky ground. Rivals of Benjamin Netanyahu are joining together to form a coalition to unseat him. They are not political allies and have little in common except their desire to no longer have Netanyahu running the country. Crystal Gamansing looks at the political upheaval underway in Israel tonight.
After 12 years in power, Benjamin Netanyahu has mastered outmaneuvering his opponents. But his reign in Israel may be coming to an end.
So I think it's a very dramatic moment for Israel and politics, and for Bennett himself. He's taking a huge gamble.
This man, Naftali Bennett, a far-right politician, announced Sunday he's joining forces with centrist Yair Lapid to dethrone Netanyahu.
God willing, together we can rescue the country from its tailspin and return it on its path.
It's a path full of roadblocks, according to Lapid, but one the country needs to travel. If this government is formed, he said, the key word will be responsibility. To take responsibility, to restore inner calm, not blame others, not look for enemies. After 11 days of bombings that killed more than 250 people, most of them in Gaza, a ceasefire is holding, allowing the opportunity for this new coalition. But this expert in Middle East politics says it will be difficult to form government because several small parties with very different views, including the United Arab List, will have to work together.
That's not to say that the Arabs in Israel will have a greater say in politics, but they will at least be at the table.
While many would like peace as the main focus, agreeable domestic issues will likely take center stage. But the ultimate goal for this coalition, should it form, is to oust Netanyahu and see him face corruption charges, which he's been fighting for years. The deadline to present a new cabinet to the president is Wednesday night. Crystal Gamansing, Global News, London.
Leafs versus Habs up next. The electricity ramps up for a classic Canadian rivalry. It will be a nail-biting night for Habs and Leafs fans. They go head-to-head tonight in Game 7 of the playoffs, and a lucky 550 fans will be there to see it in person in Toronto. They are fully vaccinated healthcare workers. It's not clear if they'll all be cheering for the Leafs, but with the history that team has in the playoffs, they can use all the help they can get. Here's Eric Sorensen.
Hoping for the best. It's got a lot of nerves, you know what I mean?
Oh, every Leafs fan knows what Alex Rennie means. The fear that this could happen one more time. 2 straight overtime losses puts the Toronto Maple Leafs on the cusp of adding another chapter in its saga of sports futility. They've not won a playoff series in 17 years. And it's been 54 years since this. 1967 was their last Stanley Cup. Fast forward half a century, with a bevy of stars and veterans, expectations to end the drought have never been higher.
This was the season that everything seemed to be going right for them. They had great scores. It just seemed like the year of destiny.
It's been a year unlike any other. Played in empty Canadian arenas until Saturday's game in Montreal welcomed fans. And now Toronto is doing the same. For many, something more meaningful is happening off the ice than on. 550 healthcare workers, fully vaccinated, attending the game in person. A way of thanking frontline workers for their courage and hard work during the pandemic, and a sign that life in this country is getting back to normal. Ann Patel is a nurse and thrilled that healthcare workers were picked to be in the stands.
Absolutely, and all of us want that because we are tired of this pandemic.
The healthcare workers deserve it, though. I mean, what they've been through this last year and change, it's unlike anything we've ever seen.
As thoughts turn to the game, the two Canadian teams with the longest history will engineer one more memorable outcome. For Montreal, a win would be a sweet surprise. For Toronto, an end to a legacy of playoff failure. A loss for the Leafs could change the fortunes for everyone from management to the coaches to the players.
This game is probably the most important franchise game in the last several decades.
But for Leafs fans, this is no time for pessimism.
It's Game 7. Game 7s are always unique. So long as we play a good game, I mean, you can't really ask for more.
Well, the Leafs could ask to win a playoff series for a change. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
And that is Global National for this Monday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Here Canada is Island Lake in Alberta. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.